So we're told there's no state religion in the West, certainly not in the United States, but in fact there is. It's scientism.
Christianity. Wait, what was your answer?
It's scientism. It's the worship of science. It's the belief, and all of us learn this at a young age, that everything around us, everything we experience, can be measured by people in white coats. That's science. And if it can't be measured, it's not real.
To be real is to possess properties, to exist independently of perception or thought, and to manifest in an intelligible way. The scientific method is one great way of demonstrating what's real, but if you have others that fit the bill, I'm all ears.
The problem with this religion is that our life, our daily experience, contradicts it. Constantly, all of us are seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling things that can't be measured by science, but it doesn't make them any less real.
If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
These are, by definition, supernatural. Supernatural experiences are a feature of everyone's life. And if we're honest, we'll admit that.
I think what you mean is that many have experiences that they attribute to the supernatural. In my life, I've attributed many experiences to the supernatural, but I now think I was doing so falsely. But if we're honest, we'll admit we don't know. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, we're returning to a nemesis in the Paulogia Rogues Gallery, Lee Strobel.
Well, Lee Strobel was a reporter. He worked for the Chicago Tribune and left and became a pastor. So he has religious faith, but also a grounding in empiricism, the desire to prove things.
Dr. Travis Proctor, associate professor at Wittenberg University, specializing in ancient Mediterranean religions. Welcome to the land of cartoons and apologists.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be here and really happy to chat with you.
Before we begin, do you know of Lee Strobel?
I know of him and I read some works. I have a past, as many scholars do in this field, of being a part of a Christian movement. And yeah, I read one or two of his books when I was in college. And so familiar with some of his kind of basic work and his background.
Very good. Now, before we dive into Lee's take on the supernatural, I'll mention that Travis has joined the lineup of scholars over at the religion department with a lecture on the rise of Christianity. For those unfamiliar,
I still remember that feeling of nerdy excitement opening up the course catalog for the first time and scrolling through pages and pages of classes. And I distinctly remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, I get to take any of these? And it's exactly that feeling I want to recreate for you with a new project we're launching. We're calling it the religion department because that's what we're modeling it after. When we were in school, the department on campus was more than just a place where you take classes. It was a hub. There were professors who each specialized in totally different corners of religious studies: Buddhism, Islam, early Christianity, indigenous traditions, sociology, anthropology, psychology, you name it. There were regular guest lectures you could drop in whenever you had the time, and there were semester-long seminars where you could dig into a particular tradition or topic. Under one roof, you could study almost anything, always with a professor who has worked for years to make sure that what you're learning is accurate and nuanced. And there's also this deep sense of community. People hanging out in the grad student lounge, swapping book recommendations, helping each other come up with research topics. That's the atmosphere we want to create here. We brought together a roster of experts from all different backgrounds, each bringing their own area of expertise. You'll be joining a community of learners and teachers exploring this absolutely fascinating world of religion. I hope to see you there.
and we'll talk about that again later in the video, but the real reason Travis is here is because Lee Strobel recently released yet another book in his expanding library of apologetic tomes.
Lee Strobel. So you've written a book. I don't do a lot of book interviews, but I couldn't resist this one. Seeing the Supernatural, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen World.
Right.
I think a lot of us sense or know on some level, in fact, I think everybody knows on some level, that there is a world that science can't measure or quantify.
Yeah.
That there is, that there's stuff that we can't explain.
Yeah.
But that it's no less real for our inability to explain it.
Now, normally I might tackle this interview on my own, but it turns out Tucker and Lee pre-poisoned the well against anyone who might disagree with them.
Yeah, atheism is the leap of imagination.
It is. That's true.
It's hard to be an atheist.
It's very true.
Admire them in a way, though. Feel sorry for them. By the way, anyone who denies the soul exists, probably getting ready to genocide you.
I'm getting ready to what now?
It's like
Kind of a soulless experience.
Well, if there's no human soul, then how is murder wrong?
Well, exactly. And they'll say free will is impossible. So there's no free will. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Since his audience is now unlikely to accept any critique from a crazy, soulless, murder-bound, pitiful atheist, I decided our time would be better spent evaluating Lee's beliefs about the supernatural against early Christianity's beliefs about the supernatural. Would the first followers of Jesus have endorsed these conclusions by Lee and Tucker? And that's why I needed the author of Demonic Bodies and the Dark Ecologies of Early Christian Culture to be my proxy, and we can compare book to book. Lee's book is for apologetic purposes. What prompted yours?
Yeah, so it really was an interest actually in thinking about Christian cultures across the centuries and the role that demons play in them. So I first got into it actually by reading an early apologist, Justin Martyr, a second century Christian apologist. I was interested in Justin mostly because I was interested in ancient philosophy and thinking about religion and philosophy and their intersection in the ancient world. But then what really struck me when I started reading Justin was just how much demons show up. And I was fascinated by this because modern philosophical traditions, oftentimes demons aren't really a part of those. They're oftentimes thought of as characteristic of more superstitious beliefs or something like that. So it fascinated me that an early Christian apologist who was thought of himself as a philosopher was appealing to demons so much as a way to explain his world and his religion. And so that just got me fascinated in the role of demons in early Christianity. So that got me into the book. And I got interested in thinking about demonic bodies in part because when I started studying early Christianity as part of my master's and then doctoral degrees, I started to notice in various Christian authors that I read that there wasn't one way of thinking about demons broadly, and especially this issue of demonic bodies. How did demons appear? And I started picking up on a pattern that Christians would talk about demonic bodies in really different ways, but oftentimes correlating to, let's say, the things they were concerned about, the theological issues that bothered them in their day, or maybe opponents they were battling with, either other Christian opponents or non-Christian opponents. The ultimate argument is that there was no one Christian demonology. There were many in the early Christian period, but that if we delve deep into that, as the book tries to do, I think we can learn some things about what's going on in early Christianity, what's kind of bothering some of these authors as they try to work out their religious ideas and practices.
Well, based on what you just said, you're basically telling me that nothing has changed for 2,000 years.
Yeah, that's right. It's diversity and contestation all the way down.
A lot of people that just don't delve into
There's a
these
de-emphasis.
There's a de-emphasis in many churches and in many Christian lives. And yet Jesus clearly believed not only in angels, but he was an exorcist. Even skeptics will admit, according to the Gospels, that Jesus was an exorcist. So he believed in Satan. He believed in demons.
Well, it was one of the primary activities of his life on earth.
Exactly. Yeah. Look at the Gospel of Mark. I think half of his activity is related in some way to fighting demons.
I've been fighting demons since before you could shave.
This is something as a Christian that we ought to believe and then consider what are the implications of this. That if this is true, if there is a demonic realm, if there is an angelic realm, what are the implications to me today? I was an atheist. I'm trained in journalism and law. And so I'm always looking for corroboration.
Yes.
I'm looking for evidence.
Yes,
I'm looking for facts. And so you're right. I think there's an intuitive sense that most people have that there's something beyond what we can see, touch, or put in a test tube. 8 out of 10 Americans believe that. But how do we know? What is the evidence? And that's what I try to get into in the book. How can we be sure through corroborated evidence that indeed there are such things as miracles, as near-death experiences, as deathbed encounters, and mystical dreams and things like that?
If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say.
Well, I would put it another way. Are you aware of any society in the known history of the human race that didn't believe that there was a supernatural realm filled with good and evil?
Yes, it's virtually universal.
She turned me into a newt. A newt. I got better.
This is my totally ignorant read of it.
Yeah.
But when the supernatural host, when all these supernatural beings are referred to in the Bible, there's almost a sense in which the writer is assuming the reader already knows all this.
Yes, that's right. It doesn't have a passage that says, by the way,
these things are real.
Yeah, let me explain all this to you.
Yes.
No, it doesn't do that, which is interesting.
Because the culture at the time was familiar with this, and there was kind of no debate that there was a supernatural.
Tucker and Lee have this right? Did all cultures in history, and early Christians in particular, view the supernatural realm the way they do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that I think is really important for understanding the differences between modern discussions of demons or the so-called supernatural or spiritual and ancient discussions of those topics. So I think the first most simple point is that ancient thinkers, including Christians, would not have conceptualized such a stark divide between natural and supernatural. Most scholars today would attribute that to more modern discourses, especially, thinkers like Descartes, who really posited a strong distinction between lower material realms and higher ethereal spiritual realm. And so that idea of natural versus supernatural really arises out of the birth of scientific discourses in Europe and early modernity. And then religious thinkers pick that up, and Strobel is part of this tradition of picking up that idea that there's a supernatural realm that's different or kind of above the natural realm, different kinds of thinking or evidence or what have you. Early Christians would have posited some divides within their world. Sometimes thinkers in the ancient world divided up the cosmos into different sections. And they did think that divine beings were in one section and humans were in another and those kinds of things. So there were divisions of the cosmos, but not in a way that posited this major distinction between natural and supernatural. And one point that I try to make in my book, In Demonic Bodies, and the reason why that kind of subtitle of dark ecologies is because my ultimate argument is that demons and the other things, angels as well, were part of kind of the ecology of the early Christian world in the same way that a grove of trees would have been part of an ecology for early Christians. Now, that's not me, the scholar, affirming that reality, but it's saying for early Christian experience, they experienced the reality of demons as being just as real as kind of natural things in their world. If we want to understand their culture, we have to think of them as part of that kind of ecology. So I would really push back on any kind of idea of natural versus supernatural, at least in the ancient world. I think that's actually a pretty modern idea. Just thinking about some more modern philosophical debates about, including things about theology, there is some danger to positing that idea of, there's this natural realm where science can kind of give us knowledge, and there's a supernatural realm where the divine and we have to use something different for that. In part because, as many thinkers have pointed out, it creates a kind of God of the gaps. God is the thing that can explain the things that we can't explain. The real problem with that, I'm sure, as you know, Paul, is that, what happens when new knowledge explains the things that used to be explained by God? And all of a sudden, God kind of in the divine realm starts to shrink. And so one example of that might be a Christian 500 years ago might have been very likely to say, hey, science can't tell us much about the stars, and they're clearly heavenly. What happens when Galileo invents a telescope and all of a sudden we have 500 years of astronomical knowledge piled up? That God is shrunk now. That gap is kind of no longer there. And so that's a more of a philosophical, theological problem that even Christian thinkers, I think, have pointed out. So I think there's a little bit of both a historical and philosophical issue with making that divide there.
And your book said something about demons live in the airy atmosphere or something like that?
That's right. Lots of ancient thinkers, including some Christian thinkers, did divide the cosmos into different levels. The idea was that there's the earthly level where humans and animals live. But then you did have upper regions of the cosmos, and some would be like the middle atmosphere, and they would say birds live there, but also other, let's say, lighter bodied things. And that could be angels, demons, other kinds of spirits, what have you, that if you believed in those things, that's where you thought they lived. And then if you went into higher realms, you had even more kind of higher divine things. And so if you're a Platonist in the ancient world, you often thought that the highest divine being, who is kind of purely disembodied in our idea of a body at least, lived in that very upper realm. And so that there are ways in which the ancients divided, and demons existed in that kind of middle atmosphere between heaven and earth.
So now, is it when Paul says that he was up to the third heaven, is that related?
It is related. There were ideas that we can find in Second Temple Judaism of there being different levels of heaven, but it is related, as you're pointing out, Paul, to this idea of there being different levels of the cosmos. And as we find, especially in later mystical traditions, we find it in some early Christian traditions too, ideas of there being levels of heaven that correspond to the relative divinity of things. And this comes to be folded in with ideas of hierarchies of angels, for example. And the idea was that Christians or Jews who had this idea would say, well, when you die, you have to kind of go up through the levels of heaven. And sometimes you might have to do certain things or have a password to get through. So Paul seems to have he probably doesn't have that full-fledged idea, but he seems to be building off of kind of ancient ideas like that.
And what's interesting about the Christian interpretation of angels is that it says in the book of Hebrews in the Bible that we should anticipate the possibility that we would encounter an angel. In other words, it says sometimes when you're providing hospitality to someone, unbeknownst to you, it's an angel. And so there's an anticipation that perhaps there could be angelic encounters. I think that may have been an angelic encounter that I had. I can't prove it. So in other words, the implication is that we will have angelic encounters, but we won't realize they're angels. And I think that does happen. So I think, yeah, there are cases where I think the logical explanation, the most reasonable explanation, if you don't rule out the supernatural at the outset, is that it was an angelic encounter.
This is a really fascinating thing because it really reveals a major tension or point of concern for many early Christians. From the beginning of the Christian movement, there were kind of two strong ideas. One was that there was this thing called the Holy Spirit, and that God could intervene in this earth really at any time to maybe inspire prophecy or inspire some type of teaching or something like that. And that spirit could indwell people or can inspire people in some way. But at the same time, from our earliest Christian writings, we also have this idea that there are these things called demons, evil spirits that could also indwell people, could also inspire people to say things or do things, but not in such a good way. And the challenge for Christians throughout history, but from the very beginning, was to try to explain, how do you tell the difference? How do you know when somebody is spirit inspired by the Holy Spirit, and how do you know when they're demonically possessed? And as, writers like Paul and others, like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century admitted, it was really, really difficult. One of my chapters is on Justin Martyr, and what he really argues is that one of the main things you know about demons is that they can change shape. They can basically appear as almost whatever they want to appear as. Or we can have, Paul has this tradition of Lucifer appearing like an angel of light, for example. So basically saying that the Satan figure could kind of look like what we might expect an angel to look like, a good angel. So from the very beginnings, Christians admit there are these at least two kinds of spirits that can indwell you or inspire you, good or bad ways, and also that it's really hard to tell the difference. And then I think what's fascinating historically is that Christians, again, don't give one answer to this. They have different answers. So the Shepherd of Hermas, 2nd century Christian text, included in some early Bibles, gives an answer that, well, you'll mostly be able to tell because of how the person who is speaking comport themselves, what their attributes are. Are they honest, or do they have good ethics? Are they treating other people well? If that's true, then you could probably be confident that they're a good prophet inspired by the Spirit. But if they're greedy or lustful or something, you could probably be confident that they... But others don't really go that route. Other Christians say, no, the only way you can really tell is based on the teaching. That is, does the teaching align with what is orthodox, or does it align with so-called heresy? Now, you can see that can become pretty circular pretty quickly, but it's a very different way of trying to think about demons versus angels or the Holy Spirit or what have you. So there's no one Christian solution. I would say that's true today, too, among Christian cultures. There's no one solution. It does oftentimes depend on kind of orthodoxy versus heresy. But as you were hinting at earlier, Paul, a lot of what this comes to be are, demons or the Holy Spirit come to be cited as part of social conflicts. And so basically demons come to be attributed to the movements that you're not so fond of. And the Holy Spirit is the spirit that's inspiring, your movement and the movements you like, of course. So that's really kind of the ultimate rubric that I think ends up getting mentioned. Whatever we might posit about the realities of demons or angels or spirits, it's clear they're having an effect on social realities, on how Christians thought about each other, especially, or maybe about non-Christians as well. And this problem of good and bad spirits both existing in the Christian world is something that then I think has major ramifications for early Christians.
I've never asked that question at a dinner party, but I have asked, has anyone seen a ghost?
Yeah. 100%
of the time, there's someone at the table who has.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
What is that?
Ghosts, I have a chapter on ghosts and psychics in my book. The technical definition of a ghost is someone who dies but refuses to go into the afterlife. Their spirit refuses to go into the next life. I don't see that in the Bible. So I don't think that ghosts per se are from God. I think most likely an apparition that we interpret as being ghosts is most like a demonic apparition.
I think people feel that.
I think so. They
Ghosts have a bad rep.
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
No one is summoning ghosts.
It's not like Casper who's going to bring you some flowers.
Generally, people are anti-ghost.
One thing to note is just that the belief in ghosts in the ancient Mediterranean, when Christianity comes on the scene, very widespread. We have many ancient ghost stories. And this is maybe what Strobel's trying to get at, but many of the explanations for why a deceased soul might stick around are actually really similar to what we find today in contemporary ghost stories.
Then why don't you just move on? I don't believe in that.
Namely, they have unfinished business. Maybe they died too soon and they want to stick around to finish that business. Or maybe they had a particularly violent end. Maybe they were murdered or died in war. Or maybe they died before they could hit certain kind of aspects of life that were expected. There was a category of ghosts in the ancient world for the unmarried, because so if you didn't, and then you died, well, then you might live on as a kind of, because you still have that unfinished business. So that's really prevalent in the ancient world when Christianity comes onto the scene. And I think that's important for shaping a few things. One is that, for example, stories about Jesus' resurrection that we find in the New Testament Gospels, certain aspects of that, I think many of them are trying to prove to the audience that this isn't a ghost story. Because that'd probably be the first response of an ancient person, where somebody said, hey, this religious leader that I followed was murdered violently before his time, and I saw him after he died. That sounds like an ancient ghost story. Many of the Gospels are written in a way, I think, to try to say, hey, this is not your normal ghost story. This is a resurrection story. So that's just one kind of background that I think is important for thinking about early Christian literature. I think, to Strobel's point, he's mostly in line with common Christian teaching. Scholars like Tertullian, Justin Martyr, when they talk about ghosts, they tend to explain them as demons. And they say these are actually demons who are deceiving people, maybe even doing magical practices like ghosts were said to be able to do. If you wanted to do like a magical ritual, you would try to get control of a deceased spirit. And Tertullian and other Christian writers, they're not big fans of magic. And so they want to say, listen, if you hear stories about ghosts and magic and stuff, not true. Those are just demons who are tricking people. Again, they would probably explain most cases of demons as that kind of trickery going on. So I think Strobel stands in a long line of Christian teaching, in part because, I think the real problem that ghost stories present for Christian worldview is that, well, they don't really fit well with standard Christian ideas about the afterlife.
I'm not quite sure what to do with it, because I talk about a couple of cases in the book where a dead relative returns and a person talks to that relative and then they disappear, and then their child comes in. 8-year-old child says, I just saw grandpa. I just talked to him. So he experienced the same vision. Well, that's pretty weird.
Yeah.
Is that corroboration and so forth? Well, here's my concern. So many times the people have contact with these dead people. These are people that lived ungodly lives. And yet they say everything's fine. I'm fine. Everything's good. Just take care of the family. Tell everybody I love them. I'm good. Don't worry about me. That's the general message people get. Well, what does that say to someone who is thinking about, what do I need to do to live a life that will bring me to heaven and to God? Well, Uncle Tom came and told me he's fine. He was a adulterer and he never came to faith in Jesus. He's a bad guy. And yet he says he's fine in the afterlife. Wouldn't that be something that a demon might want to imitate to send a false message? I think maybe.
Now, there's a diverse ideas of Christian ideas about the afterlife from the very beginning. Whether you think that there's a resurrection where the dead are mostly dead for a while, then they're resurrected and judged, and then they go to maybe a heavenly or bad place. Well, how does a ghost fit into that? That person's supposed to be deceived until the resurrection. On the other hand, if you believe, as many Christians do today, that immediately upon death, you get judged and you either go to a good or bad place, or maybe somewhere in between if you believe in purgatory. Again, where does a ghost fit in that? That sounds like a deceased person that's not getting judged. That doesn't really fit. So ghosts are a real problem for Christian theology. The other problem is that lots of people believe in ghosts. And so it's a major problem for Christian teachers, again, in antiquity and today, because honestly, most of their parishioners probably believe in ghosts in some way. I think Strobel is probably struggling with this too. Ghosts don't really fit with Christian theology. Many of his readers probably do believe in ghosts in some way. It's a problem that Christian thinkers have had to kind of struggle with, I think, for a long time. It's added to the struggle, as you point out, Paul, because of the Witch of Endor. That throws a wrench into the whole thing, because you could just argue these are all fake. They're deceptions by demons. But then you have this story in the Bible, Hebrew Bible, where a so-called witch or medium is able to actually summon the ghost of a deceased person, and it works. And the deceased person gives an accurate prophecy. This is Samuel, the prophet, right? He comes back.
Yep.
And he says something that's true, and it all seems to work. And then, this doesn't seem to be a demon. This seems to be Samuel, and he seems to have divine knowledge that he shares, in that case with Saul and the medium.
I think the transfiguration and the incident with what's called the medium of Endor in the Old Testament may be one-offs. And those are unusual circumstances. So Tucker, I'm not quite sure what to do with it.
Again, this is a problem for early Christian interpreters as well. There's lots to say about that story. It's probably actually the ancient writers who were writing the story were actually probably poking fun a little bit at ancient ghost stories and ancient media.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it was probably originally a little bit of a parody story because ultimately the story happens where Saul does something he's not supposed to do. He consults a medium. He had outlawed that, so he's not supposed to be doing this. And he gets Samuel to talk to him. But then what ultimately happens is that Saul learns the thing that he kind of already knew.
Your insight serves you well.
Which is that he's been condemned by God. He's going to lose his power very soon. So I think it's a little bit of a parody of those stories, actually, in many ways. But early Christian writers really have a problem with this because it clearly seems to be a case where so-called magic works, we might call it witchcraft or something, and a ghost actually comes back and is able to speak with someone. I think they explained it in different ways. Sometimes they explain it as, well, anything is possible with God, and for some reason, God allowed this thing to happen in this case, and we can't otherwise explain it. Some did actually try to explain it that this, again, was demonic trickery, that Saul misperceived that this was Samuel, and this was, in fact, not Samuel. This was actually a demon that was tricking Saul. That's probably the minority view among Christian writers, but it was one way to try to solve it. So I think it still presents challenges for people like Strobel today because it's a ghost story we have right there in the Bible, and it wouldn't seem to fit all that well with most standard theologies.
Well, that parody meant that growing up, I couldn't play Dungeons and Dragons or read Harry Potter. So,
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think the function it served, what you're pointing to, like modern function of those, very similar to the ancient world, where part of the parody was those writers trying to warn, I think, their readers, hey, we Jews, we can't get mixed up in, say, Assyrian or Babylonian culture. And at that time, at various historical periods, Babylonians become known for magical practices, including ghost mediums. And so it's trying to warn them and say, hey, if you want to stay true to the Israelite God, you can't get mixed up in those things. But I think it's demon stories today. We think about modern exorcism films that start off with a Ouija board, and that's the thing that gets the demon involved, Very similar, I think, social function of trying to warn people against what that writer or artist or whatever doesn't want people to do.
But demons, it started out with Lucifer, whose name means morning star, and he was kind of first among angels.
Name means morning star?
Yeah, Lucifer.
Lucifer Morningstar, your substitute counselor and resident bad influence.
He becomes Satan, and the name Satan literally means adversary. And so the implication in Scripture is that this very prominent angel named Lucifer wanted to be worshipped. He's the one who wanted the worship. And so his pride is what resulted in him falling from the angelic realm, becoming Satan, becoming someone. And you think about this, when Jesus encounters Satan, what is it Satan wanted from him? Worship. Satan wanted Jesus to worship him. And that's what Lucifer wanted. It was pride that got in the way. He becomes Satan. And a certain percentage of the angels accompanied him in this fall. This happened before the fall of humankind in the Garden of Eden. So this predates that. We don't know how many angels accompanied him, but there are a lot of angels. In Revelation chapter 5, there's a scene of Jesus on the throne being worshiped. And if you do the math, because it talks about it a little cryptically, it was 100 million angels worshiping him at that time. So there's a lot of angels, and a percentage of them fell with Lucifer. He became Satan, and angels became his minions, so to speak.
I would say that, generally speaking, that version of Satan's fall, and that's where demons come from, a kind of demonic etiology, if you will, is pretty late and doesn't match up all that well with the majority view among early Christians in the earliest time period. So I would say that story of Lucifer and the fall, at least the full version of it, really becomes dominant in late antiquity. Maybe 300s, 400s, I would say, especially in 500s, we start to see that story become more common. Authoritative thinkers like Augustine pick it up and make it really popular among their readers. But if you go into the period before that, even some New Testament texts, 2nd and 3rd century texts, you find a much more common story that we actually find among Second Temple Jewish texts that aren't in the Bible, but would have been included in ancient Jewish and Christian scriptures in antiquity. So, for example, one text, 1st Enoch, has a version of the fall of the angels. It's actually kind of an expansion of Genesis 6. In Genesis 6, we have this really short, kind of odd story about the sons of God, the daughters of men, and something called the Nephilim. And whatever happens there, the flood happens next. So it's bad. Something clearly pretty bad happened, but it's really short on details. Well, First Enoch is kind of an expanded version of that story. How it narrates what happens is that there are these angels that fall because they are assigned to watch over the earth, but they start to look too closely, especially at mortal women, and they become tempted. They fall to earth, they have sexual relations with those mortal women, and they create what are called Nephilim in Genesis 6, but First Enoch calls them giants. They're apparently these gigantic, monstrous creatures. These giants cause all kind of havoc because of also the fall of the angels. All kinds of bad divine knowledge gets spread on the earth, so humans are doing all kinds of bad things. And according to First Enoch, well, this is why God sends the flood in the time of Noah. It's because of this fall of angels, the giants are wreaking havoc, evil is all over the earth, and God has to hit the reset button. What's significant about that is that helps explain both kind of the origins of evil, but also the origins of demons. According to this story, evil spirits or demons come about because giants drown in the flood alongside other earthly creatures.
Oh.
But when they drown in the flood, their spirits, and it seems like maybe they had some angelic spirits thanks to their angelic fathers. Their spirits survive. So they kind of survive. They don't get drowned in the flood. They survive, and they survive as demons or evil spirits. This was a very common idea in Second Temple Judaism. We also find in other texts like Jubilees, we find these figures mentioned in other Second Temple Jewish texts. And interestingly, we find it mentioned by the earliest Jesus followers and earliest Christians. And this seems to have been a kind of assumed etiology for demons, at least early on. And also seems to have been the main way, if early Christians talked about some chief demon figure like Satan, but they had other names for him as well, they oftentimes cited this story. And so it wasn't necessarily about, say, like pride, and then somebody fell because of their pride and they took some angels with them. It was actually instead about sexual temptation and a fall. And then this chief fallen angel figure, again, called by other names in other texts. Sometimes in some Second Temple Jewish texts, that word Satan is used. And that's where we think Christians why they start to use that word. But this seems to have been a dominant way that early Christians talked about the origins of evil and the origins of demons. Now, we do have some hints of that later tradition. So I think Strobel and that broader tradition are building on the story in Revelation about the dragon and the stars falling, and a certain percentage of stars fall, etc. So there are some hints of that story taking shape among some early Christians. But again, that's a book of Revelation, so we might think late first century. But even Christians after that, like Justin Martyr or Tertullian, are two authors in the second century that clearly are citing versions of First Enoch or the fallen angel myth more broadly, and don't seem to be building on that idea of Lucifer as a prideful angel. Instead, they're building on this idea of the fallen angels. So, yeah.
So how did they deal with the Gospel of Matthew?
Yeah.
Right after Jesus is baptized, he gets tempted by Satan.
Yeah.
And that was written in the first century. How would the audience have understood that figure?
Yeah, great question. Definitely by the time of at least our earliest Gospels, we have some figure called Satan. Other names are still maybe used for him, like Beelzebul, for example. But it seems like that word Satan has started to be used more commonly. Whereas in the Second Temple Jewish text, it's many different ones, like Samael or Semihaza, for example, are a couple other ones that are used for chief demon or chief fallen angel figures. But it does seem like by the early Jesus movement texts, like the Gospels, we have this idea of a Satan as more standardized, at least. And what's unclear is just kind of what's the origin of that figure. In many of the texts, there's clearly a fall. What is in Luke, Jesus says, I see Satan falling like lightning, for example. But then the question is, okay, but why? Is it because of sexual temptation, or is it because of pride? And it seems like that it's underdeveloped there, or they're just not explicit. I do think that probably what's going on is that there are parallel ancient Jewish traditions. Maybe some early ideas of Satan being a prideful angel are taking shape, but then you also have this very strong tradition of Enochic sexual temptation being the cause. And for a while, one kind of dominates, the Enochic tradition. But then eventually that other idea of the prideful Satan kind of takes over. So I think that they're probably existing side by side from pretty early on, but eventually they kind of flip in terms of prominence.
Okay.
A true Christian cannot be demonically possessed. And the reason is a true Christian is indwelled by the Holy Spirit. And you can't be indwelled by evil and good like that in the same way at the same time. So Christians cannot be possessed, but they can be oppressed. They can be hectored. They can be bothered. They can be attacked by demons. And there are some amazing examples of that. I just mentioned a couple of people who are hectored or bothered by demons. Now, for Christians, the book of James says if you rebuke Satan, he'll go away.
I rebuke you. I rebuke you.
So if you're a Christian, you don't have to be afraid that, these demons are going to somehow possess you or kill you or whatever.
Is that how early Christians saw it?
They do have a similar idea that when you become a Christian and you get the Holy Spirit in some form, usually as part of baptism, in some way that protects you from or gets rid of evil spirits. I think that general idea is pretty common in early Christianity. Tertullian's a great early witness to that idea. He goes into quite a bit of detail about it in some of his writings. He tends to think that if you're not a Christian, but especially if you've at all been involved in other religious traditions, what we might call paganism, with scare quotes around that term, he thinks, well, those are really just demons that are acting like gods. And so if you get involved in that, you're going to have a demon like inside of you. But when you become a Christian, when you're baptized, the Holy Spirit comes and kind of gets rid of that demonic influence. Now, having said that, early Christians, I don't think they'd go quite as far as Strobel here, at least in the way I'm reading him, in terms of really making a strong case that you're heavily protected against demons and demonic attack, or that you can't really be possessed in quite that way. I think most early Christians still seem to have had a concern that they could be attacked or oppressed by demons or even possessed by demons at times. We see that in early monastic literature, for example. Even among our holiest of Christians, they seem to have been quite concerned that demons might at least attack them, but possibly possess them as well. And for Tertullian especially, while he does think the Holy Spirit protects you in a certain way, it's always contingent on your kind of behavior continuing to be kind of up to his Christian standard.
Oh.
And so, for example, he tells an interesting story that he says a believer, a Christian woman apparently, who was, otherwise a part of the community, but she goes to see a theatrical show. And for many Christian moralists and other actually pagan moralists too, they oftentimes had major problems with ancient theater. Ancient theater was very bawdy and had quite a bit of, let's say, adult content. And so if you were a moralist in the ancient world, including religious moralists like many Christian writers, you had major problems with the theater. They talked about a lot of stuff you didn't want your parishioners talking about. Well, what Tertullian claims is that this Christian woman went to a show and that soon after she becomes possessed by a demon. And then when they're exorcising the demon, the Christian exorcists come in and they're getting rid of it. He claims that when the demon was coming out, it said, well, you can't really blame me. She was in my territory. So basically, this Christian woman went into the territory of demons, the theater, and because of that becomes possessed. And so you could see that, at least for Tertullian, there's, you're still in quite a bit of danger. If you slip up even a little bit, you go to a show with some friends and you could come back with a demon in you, even if you're otherwise a very pious Christian. And Tertullian makes similar claims about even if you attend and in some way participate in, again, any rituals, even civic rituals that have the Greco-Roman gods involved. If you do any kind of activity like that, you are putting yourself in danger of that. So again, Christians had this idea that they're in some way protected, but I think also alongside that idea, they also believe they were kind of vulnerable to that, including to be possessed by demons. So I think Strobel's breaking a little bit from how early Christians would have thought about that.
Well, when I was growing up, I was taught that the rapture could happen at any time. So I needed to make sure that I wasn't watching a movie or be in a place where Jesus couldn't find me.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If Satan were smart, which he is, would he go around the country and around the world trying to possess or bother average everyday people? Well, you know what? Much more efficient to go to Hollywood and to influence a bunch of people there who are very influential in, let's say, the entertainment industry. And let's say he encourages them to create films and television shows that are funny and that are creative and that are fun, but there's an underlying message to them, that there's a normalization of immoral activity that makes it normal. Because, when we laugh, it opens us up to various possibilities. When we laugh, our defenses come down. Underlying that is a very ugly sexual ethic. That normalizes multiple sexual partners and that sort of thing. The kind of thing that Satan would love to inculcate into American culture. And you know what? I think it's much more efficient for Satan to influence movie makers and TV makers in Hollywood to create products that feed us stuff that, without us even realizing it, open us up to the occult, open us up to immoral activity, normalize it in ways that, well, if Monica can do that on Friends, I can certainly have sex on the first date with this guy.
That wasn't a real date. What the hell do you do on a real date?
because it is logical that if Satan were to try to influence a culture in a mass way, that is a logical way that he would do it. And guess what? By the way, look at all the dysfunction we see in that community. It does seem to match up. Put yourself in Satan's place. How are you going to impact the maximum number of people? You're going to want to go after leaders. You're going to want to go after religious leaders. You're going to want to go after children. You're going to, and influence them at a young age.
You see all of that. I often think this is such a wonderful country, despite all its problems. I'm totally convinced it's the best country, having been to a lot of countries.
Yeah.
But our leadership is the worst.
Yeah,
they're the worst. They're like the worst people I've ever met. Mm. And maybe that's not accidental.
Yeah, I mean, could it be, I'll just raise the question, could it be that some people have received some assistance from demonic
certainly seems that way
in terms of achieving what they've achieved? And you look at if Satan's going to go after children, what is all this stuff about libraries doing children's readings and drag shows to little kids? Why would that happen? You know what? Because if you can capture the mind of a child very young, it could influence them for the rest of their life.
No, I think Strobel is participating in a long line of kind of historical, what we might call demonization. Citing demons and associating them with the social or cultural things that you disapprove of. And so for early Christians, this might have been different, but part of what my book traces out is that thinking about what demons represent for an early Christian author is kind of a quick shortcut to figuring out what they really care about. And what I note is that Christians really differed on this. So when it comes to demonic bodies, for example, I noted that Ignatius of Antioch talks about bodiless demons. And then if you dig a little bit deeper, why did Ignatius call them bodiless? That's kind of interesting. And other Christians don't really use that term that much for them. Well, it turns out that he really wants to emphasize that Jesus was resurrected in the flesh. Breaks from some of the early Christian writers who Paul thinks the flesh will not inherit the kingdom, for example. But Ignatius says, no, we are going to be fully physically embodied when we go to heaven, just like Jesus was fully physically embodied when he was resurrected. So for Ignatius, disembodiment is kind of the height of evil, if you will. He thinks these are evil ideas to think that you would be disembodied when you go to heaven. So he demonizes disembodiment in a quite literal way. Interestingly, we find other Christian texts. So for example, my book talks about the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, a so-called Gnostic text that in the complete opposite way talks about demons being associated with flesh. And so it's kind of an odd thing of like, okay, demons have flesh with this like lower material fleshly realm. And if you're worried too much about this fleshy realm, you're going to be associated with or maybe even possessed by demons. Well, why is this going on? Well, in that text, actually, the height of divinity is not having a fleshly body. So it's the exact opposite of Ignatius. In fact, it's possible these texts might have been kind of talking to each other, if you will. They might have known about each other. Okay. But the point here is just to notice really quickly how Christians had diverse ideas about what constituted being a true Christian. And demons were oftentimes their quick way of kind of showing their cards, so to speak, about who they think is a true Christian and who they don't. And I think that's true today as well. And so depending on your ethical code, depending on your ethical code as a Christian, you might associate demons, maybe the height of being a bad Christian is, maybe being too concerned with material goods and wealth and money. As we know, many Christians today have the exact opposite ethical code that actually, having lots of wealth is a sign of a divine blessing or something. You could see there where they might not be using demons to talk about wealth, but that first set of Christians might be. Or I think, Strobel here shows that he's quite concerned about the so-called culture wars of today over things like gender and sexuality when he talks about drag shows and demons being associated with those. So I think it's a long tradition of associating the demonic with the things that you want to disapprove of. And that's a quick way to understand what are Christians, what's kind of on the top of their list of things that they're concerned about or grappling with, if you will, as part of their religious tradition.
I have a chapter in the book on the existence of the soul. And because a lot of scientists today will deny that the soul exists. The Bible doesn't say, by the way, you have a soul and let me define it for you. It presumes that we have a soul.
Scientists will deny the soul exists. What's a near-death experience?
A near-death experience is when a person is clinically dead. That is generally no brain waves, no respiration, no heartbeat. Waves. Yeah, they're clinically dead. Yet, they're going to be revived. And so they're dead for a period of time, clinically dead, but they're not permanently dead. So the body will be revived at some point.
So by the measurements of science, they're dead.
That's right. That's right.
So maybe right there, if we just pause, maybe right there we have further evidence that science, while useful, of course, and life improving in some ways, does not have the tools to measure the totality of the experience.
Well, you know,
so they're actually like, that's the failure. Like, they're obviously not dead.
Yeah, that's right. They are coming back. That's right. All the signs are that they're dead. But, you know, the Bible says that, and Christianity teaches that when a person dies, their spirit separates from their body. And this is what we see in a near-death experience. This is evidence for the soul, for the spirit. So the physical body is clinically dead. There's no sign of life in the body. They're still working on you.
Has there ever been a culture that we're aware of in the entire span of human history that did not believe in the soul?
They all did.
That thought that people were just meat puppets and
exactly. I quote experts in the book that talk about that every civilization believed in the spirit, a soul that continues to live on after we die.
Strobel's comment almost comes closer to like ancient Gnosticism than it does to what we call ancient Orthodox thinkers, if you will. So I mentioned Ignatius. He's one that really wants to emphasize that even in death, even in our so-called post-mortem experience, we are some kind of combination of flesh and spirit. I think it's in part because of his kind of context and what he's worried about. He's grappling with certain Christians who have opposite teachings, and he's really worried about them. So that's part of what's shaping that. But Strobel in that, positing that pretty strong distinction between, say, flesh and spirit, and the spirit detaches, and this shows that you have a soul. That sounds a lot more like how many Gnostic thinkers were thinking about the body and soul, that this soul is kind of trapped in a fleshly body. Your soul is the divine part. The fleshly part is kind of, your mortal, earthy part. But the soul is trapped, and in order to get back to heaven, it needs to escape this thing. And therefore, Gnostics posited certain ideas about how the soul could escape, how you could make sure that you rose up to the divine realm. But as part of that, it meant that in some way you were leaving your kind of fleshly body behind. And so positing this pretty strong distinction, I think actually breaks from a lot of early Christian Orthodox theologies that would really want to posit a stronger connection between the body and soul, even in, say, afterlife type settings. And I think, okay, why is that happening? Why is somebody like Strobel positing such a strong distinction? I think this is a very kind of modern discourse, this dividing line between the physical earthly realm, and that's where our bodies are kind of at home, so to speak, and a supernatural spiritual realm where our souls would be at home, so to speak. That's a very modern division of things. And so the idea that if a soul exists, that shows us that a supernatural realm exists. Again, I think that's a really modern way of thinking about dividing lines between souls, bodies, natural, supernatural. It doesn't have that strong of a pedigree in early Christian thought because that dividing line just doesn't quite exist that way. I think the other struggle with that citation of evidence like that is that, what do you do with other religions that claim similar out-of-body experiences, similar either divine beings existing or, like in my religious studies classes that I teach, we talk about ideas both ancient and modern about so-called shamans who are oftentimes thought to be people whose soul connects with their body during sleep, and then they can transform into something else, maybe like a jaguar, for example, and carry out certain activities. Of course, a person from that culture would argue, well, near-death experiences or seeing other loved ones while you're asleep or when you have a near-death experience or something, well, that's evidence of what we might call shamanism, of soul travel. That kind of evidence is always tough. And for me, in a religious studies context, I just think about how many different cultures would explain that in different ways. To me, it doesn't lend itself to kind of one explanation because I know of so many different religious traditions that would explain it in different ways. Again, I think there's also something kind of distinctly modern about that. I think there's a way in which the birth of modern scientific discourse and its emphasis on empirical, verifiable reality challenge modern religious traditions to either reject that completely and say, we don't need empirical evidence for our religion, we're going to go on faith. That's a common argument. Or you find discourses like this, where apologists like Strobel will say, just like the sciences have empirical, verifiable realities, we need empirical, verifiable realities to say our religion is true. Again, I think that's a distinctly modern thing. Early Christians did cite some, we might call them either dreams or prophecies, of course, things like that to argue for their religious tradition. So it does have some ancient pedigree, but I think the way in which near-death experiences are used, especially, there's something very modern going on there, which I think is honestly kind of fascinating.
What's a mystical dream?
Mystical dreams, I talk about these in the book, is so fascinating to me. We have seen more Muslims become Christians in the last couple of decades than in the 1400 years since Muhammad. And it's been estimated that a quarter to a third of them, before they became a Christian, had a Jesus dream. Now, what's interesting about that is that these are corroborated dreams. I'll tell you what I mean by that. First of all, a devout Muslim has no incentive let's say in a closed country where it's even illegal to share the Christian gospel. They have no incentive to have a dream as a product of their subconscious mind about Jesus, the Jesus of Christianity, because it might lead them into apostasy. It might lead them to a death sentence in certain countries. So there's no incentive for a devout Muslim to have a dream about Jesus. And yet, we are seeing this all over the Middle East, in closed countries, in oppressive countries where Christians are persecuted and so forth.
You believe there has been an uptick in mystical dreams?
Definitely in the Middle East. In fact, get this, in Cairo, there's often an ad in the newspaper, and the ad says, call this number, and we'll tell you about the man in white you met in your dream last night.
Really?
Because there's so many of these.
How do you tell a difference between a conventional dream and a mystical dream, or are all dreams mystical? We don't know what dreams are, just for the record, as a matter of science.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's ever been able to explain what that is.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. God is in control of all. And so in a sense, everything is spiritual, right?
Yes.
I mean, God rules and so forth. So in a sense, any dream is spiritual. I think, to me, a mystical dream is one that has a strong spiritual overtones, and there's no natural explanation to say this could come from your subconscious mind. You know, I think sometimes people will write off a dream as saying, well, that's just something that came from your subconscious. Maybe you saw something on television, didn't even realize it, and it was in your subconscious. But when you have examples like the one I gave, that doesn't make sense.
Something that really, going back to antiquity, dreams, and really across cultures, dreams have oftentimes been seen as this kind of liminal space where divine messages could be communicated, like prophecies, for example. Or on the reverse side, where you might be in danger of demonic attacks, for example. It's kind of the space where you might be in between, so to speak. And that's what I mean by liminal. And therefore, you might either be more liable to receive a divine message or more susceptible to a divine attack of some sort. For one example I could think of an early Christian writer would be Tertullian, who cites, again, perhaps not a coincidence, he cites another Christian woman who, again, after she had attended some like Greco-Roman theatrical shows, had a dream where an angel was slapping her, basically. It was kind of unclear if this was like an evil angel or a good angel, because it's like physically abusing her in a kind of interesting way, a weird, problematic way. But Tertullian claims that this is kind of proof that this woman was doing a wrong thing. You know, she had gone into demonic territory, and either this is a good angel kind of reproving her, or maybe a bad angel that's kind of punishing her in some way. Another example of dreams being cited as this idea for kind of divine intervention or places where you can be deceived. Most scholars today, even while acknowledging we have odd experiences in dreams, those experiences are still culturally conditioned. When kind of what we experience in dreams is still shaped by our experiences and the cultures that we're around. This is also true of things like visions. People will interpret those things based on the cultures of which they're a part. And I think, the citation of Muslim traditions is particularly interesting. I think Strobel here is using this as kind of like an external verification of like, hey, here are these dreams by non-Christians, aka Muslims, who are having a Jesus dream and then they join our movement. This must be proof, kind of outsider verification of the truth of our claims. Well, that posits a pretty strong distinction between Christianity and Islam, that if you're a religious studies scholar, well, actually, there's quite a bit more permeability between these traditions. For example, Jesus is seen as one of the most important prophets in the Islamic tradition, really second only probably to Muhammad. And Jesus actually plays an important role in Islamic piety and Islamic traditions and Quranic traditions. While Muhammad takes precedence in many ways, Jesus plays an incredibly prominent role, as well as the mother of Jesus, Mary, for example, in the Quran and other Islamic storytelling traditions. So when I hear that, I don't think, oh, this is like a totally separate religious tradition. That sounds to me like evidence for the kind of cultural religious overlap of Christian and Islamic traditions where Jesus is serving as a particularly holy figure. And so for me, I think it's more a sign of that cultural backdrop. The ways we experience the world, including in our sleeping states, are shaped by our own, social, cultural experiences. And those kind of Jesus dreams, I would imagine, are part of that as well.
So my final question to you, Lee Strobel, and this has been amazing, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Is why do we keep ignoring it?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I think we're embarrassed sometimes by the supernatural, that people are going to think we're nuts.
But if that's real, and it clearly is real, then like it puts everything else into perspective.
Yeah. And when you take it seriously and when you look at it
How
like
could
I
you
did,
not take it seriously? If
I
you
agree.
grew up in a culture that tells you none of it's real, and yet it's super obvious that it is super obvious that it's real in some most general sense. Like the supernatural is real.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. If you believe in Jesus, you got to believe in angels. You got to believe in demons. You got to believe in Satan. You got to believe in heaven. You got to believe in hell. Because if you believe in Jesus, he taught on all those things.
Yeah.
So, my goodness, how could you not? I agree with you. How could you not?
Yeah. I mean, move on to something else.
Yeah.
Go play tennis or something.
Really fascinating for me. You know, my expertise is in antiquity, of course, but it's fascinating for me to see where kind of ancient discourses live on and continue to play a role in modern discourses as well. I'll use that to plug not just my book, of course, but also just to say, I think it just shows the value of studying religious history in general. You know, I think it can be tempting if you don't know religious or cultural history or what have you, it can be tempting to experience things today and think they're completely brand new, you know? But if you study religious history and including, say, history of apologetics or what have you, history of relation between religion and science, you start to realize how deep of roots these claims often have, even if they're showing up in distinctive ways. And so I think the Strobel interview was another great example of, while there are certain distinctive things going on there, there are also things that are repeating or carrying on long-standing traditions within either ancient or maybe early modern discourses. So I think another example that having some knowledge of religious history can just help you understand what's going on today.
That's an excellent place to leave Lee and Tucker. But as we mentioned earlier, Travis is part of the religion department team, including a lecture called Environmental Catastrophe, the Fall of Rome, and the Rise of Christianity.
And that's why I think we're so obsessed with Rome in that way, is because, well, Rome represents this kind of ending to that idealized past, one that seems a little bit worrying to us. If their world could fall, then what about our own? And so I think oftentimes we're thinking about Rome, well, in part because we're thinking about ourselves and we're worried about our own outcome.
I had never really thought about ancient climate change being a factor in the rise of Christianity, but it's compelling stuff. It's not just Christianity at the religion department, but an exploration of all kinds of human belief systems, which you can check out at tinyurl.com/religiondept, or tap on the link in the description. And by using that link, you'll also be helping to financially support the mission of this channel, which I greatly appreciate. Travis, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. This is great questions. And appreciated the chance to talk about both things, both the book and the class. That was great.
And we'll end with some wise words from Tucker Carlson.
So it turns out that YouTube is suppressing this show. On one level, that's not surprising. That's what they do. But on another level, it's shocking. With everything that's going on in the world right now, all the change taking place in our economy and our politics, with the wars we're on the cusp of fighting right now, Google has decided you should have less information rather than more. And that is totally wrong. It's immoral. What can you do about it? Well, we could whine about it. That's a waste of time. We're not in charge of Google. Or we could find a way around it, a way that you could actually get information that is true, not intentionally deceptive. The way to do that on YouTube, we think, is to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe. Hit the little bell icon to be notified when we upload and share this video. That way you'll have a much higher chance of hearing actual news and information. So we hope that you'll do that.
Thanks for watching, and until next time, later.